welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library. My name is Nathalie, and I'm a children's librarian here. And I have today with me author Laura Elliot, who wrote Louisa June and the Nazis in the Wave.
Hello, how are you? Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you for being here. I just want to tell you how wonderful and amazing and beautiful your book was. I really enjoyed reading it, and I have so many questions.
Yay. Thank you. Thank you. You made me tear up before, and you're going to make me tear up again. Thank you so much. That's lovely to hear.
So to begin, tell us about yourself. Yeah.
I was actually a journalist first. I was a senior writer with the Washingtonian magazine for 20 years before turning to historical and biographical fiction. So I very much think and write and report my historical works like I would as a reporter. And my two main beats with the magazine were women's issues and mental health and the performing arts. It was a lovely combination of things. And I wrote really long narratives, kind of fly on the wall type pieces and now people call it creative nonfiction. Way back then when I first started doing it, it was called new journalism or narrative journalism. But it was a wonderful preparation for doing fiction, because those kinds of long pieces, I would follow somebody for a month to 6 weeks, say, and write narratives that were in scenes and in dialogue. And the idea was taking large issues, but presenting them, humanizing them by finding somebody who had lived the issue and survived it, and could be kind of an everyman of the experience, which is really what you're doing in fiction in so many ways. So I ended up taking this, what I sometimes call myself an accidental novelist, even 13 novels later, because I first took the step into doing fiction because of an assignment that I got at the magazine, which was to do the dreaded holiday story. And I only say dreaded because it's so hard to find something that's not cliched or already done. The long and short of the story is it's, the December issue. So I couldn't find anything that wasn't hackneyed and trite somehow, until I remembered the best story I'd ever heard. And I only heard it a few times during my life because it was very hard for my dad to share it, but about his homecoming from World War II, which was he had been missing in action for months. His family thought he was dead. And he literally showed up in the driveway of the family farm unannounced 5 days before Christmas, 1944. So I received so many extraordinary, heartbreaking, moving, poignant letters from people talking about their experiences during the war, because this is back now 30 years, that I decided to go ahead and fictionalize it. And I highly did a lot of reporting about what the experience was like for, air crew on those bombers over Europe. And it is as much about the French people who would help those pilots and those crew members who had to bail out of these burning planes onto Nazi-occupied territory, as the people who helped them. And that's called Under a War-Torn Sky. And I wrote it specifically for young adults, because I had these precocious readers of my own, my children, and I realized that a lot of their contemporaries wouldn't have the great honor of knowing World War II veterans personally. So that book did so well, and still in a lot of curriculum, in a lot of places, World War II curriculum, 8th, 7th, 8th, 9th graders, that I've stayed here and I've just continued writing novels. So that's a long answer to your question, but that's my story.
Wow, that's so fascinating. Wow.
I've been very lucky.
Yeah. Sounds like you've experienced so much. Did your job take you to like different places, or you wrote from one location, your job?
As a reporter?
Yeah.
No, I was really working in Washington, and I did a lot of different stories that were rooted in Washington. I never did political reporting. It was more about these kind of mental health issues or women's issues like domestic violence, like sexual assault, like child abuse, things before the O.J. Simpson trial. I'm old, you're probably getting this, but I found and was blessed and really honored to write these kinds of first person experiences, not written in first person, but personal experiences of people who were living through difficult issues, and really served as inspiring. They struggled to get through it and were presented out of the blue with challenges that they managed to pull themselves together and get their families through it with kind of that extraordinary courage that ordinary people can have, which prepared me perfectly for doing, World War II kinds of pieces later.
So tell us about your book.
Louisa June and the Nazis and the Waves is very special to me, as you and I were talking about before we turned on the record button. It's my fourth World War II novel. The other three all revolve around that Under a War-Torn Sky character, Henry Forrester, because readers wanted to know more about what happened next and what happened to the hometown girlfriend. So there are three novels about Henry and his experiences. I've also been incredibly lucky to have worked with Catherine Teagan at Catherine Teagan Books at HarperCollins for years now, 20 years now. And I was just counting this up before we talked, of my 13 novels, I've done 10 with her. So I've been incredibly lucky. And she suggested to me to think about another World War II piece. And here's the thing about doing historical fiction where you really research carefully, you only get to use about 60% of what you learn, which is really aggravating. So for one of those novels in that kind of trilogy, I'll say, of the companion book, Across a War-Tossed Sea, which is set in the home front in the Richmond area, about the hometown girlfriend, Patsy, and two British boy evacuees who have come to live with them for the duration, which I discovered in a really obscure newspaper, if you want to talk about that later. But they're doing the research for that novel and rooting it around those evacuee boys, I read about a lot of things that you can't shove in everything, right? It's too much for readers to take in. I learned about these U-boat attacks and the fact that, immediately after Pearl Harbor, Hitler sent 5 U-boats to begin to target all the freighters, tankers, cargo ships going up and down our East Coast that they could, to, cut our supply lines, to keep us from being able to really ramp up our war preparation. Most people don't know about it. And the fact that between January 1942 and June 1942, those 6 months, that those 5 U-boats managed to sink 397 of our ships right off the East Coast, often within sight of land. And that the averaging, the really bad months, averaging 1 a night. And the merchant mariners who actually sailed those ships and manned them, crews from boys as young as 16 to gentlemen as old as in their 70s who kept re-upping to keep these ships going. They actually suffered the highest casualty rate of any of our services during World War II. And we just don't talk about them. We don't know about them. So it was kind of this hidden piece of history that I wanted to write about. So Louisa June is about those events, but it's really about a family who has to survive the loss of a much beloved brother, young boy, on a tugboat, an attack by U-boats, which is based on a factual sinking of a tugboat called the Menominee in March 31st, 1942. So it's about how Louisa June absorbs that loss, deals with her grief, also how she deals with kind of helping her family get through it, her mother who suffers the melancholy, as she describes it, but is also really determined to find some way to try to combat the Nazis herself. And there's some wonderful, quirky characters who help her with that. The indomitable cousin Belle, the elderly, wonderful cousin Belle, who I hope I grow up to be like myself, and her friend Emmett, and her, sassy sister who becomes a Winnie welder. All these things are rooted in people that I read about in that time period. So it's a story of sudden loss, the home front, these merchant mariner families that nobody talks about and what they did to keep the United States going. And then just how to deal with all the fallout of a sudden out of the blue death.
It was so good. And I know I've said this before off recording, but this was such a beautiful book. It was so poetic and like lyrical. And I often felt like I was reading lyrics to a song. It was just so gorgeous.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's true. It's true. And so, I mean, what inspired you, or rather like how did you get to writing in this way? It's an art. I mean, all of it is an art, but it was just gorgeous.
Thank you. I thank you. I'm almost speechless with gratitude at what you're just saying. So thank you. This is the one time I can tell you, I usually write in like third person limited, very much honed in a kind of reporting way. And I was, before we were talking, I thought, how many books have I actually done in first person? I went to check. Of the 13, I've only done 4. And I've had a revelation. They're all the ones that are for the slightly younger audience than I usually, for an older middle grade, younger YA age group. Set in Virginia. There is an immediacy for Louisa June. I wanted you to get straight into that poetic yearning heart of hers, and that kind of voice allowed me to do that. I'll be honest, she just spoke to me. That opening that you talked about that you like so much, when I was mulling this over in my mind, the things that happen, I should tell everybody that I always read and research a lot before I decide exactly what it is I'm going to write, because I let the facts tell me. So I knew I wanted to write about these U-boat attacks. I knew I wanted to root it in Chesapeake Bay area because, first off, it's a place where so many of these attacks happened. And my father's family is from that area, and I've written about that area, and I know that area, and I know that Tidewater drawl. I know that wondrous habit of speaking in pictorial language and loving, wonderfully woven anecdotes with a little dab of wry humor put into it, please. And all stories that I heard his family talk about, they would talk about, like major issues that were happening or events, but it was always told through these people, ordinary people's responses, and with all this detail about how they spoke and how they reacted and what their souls were like. And there is that deep, abiding affection and respect and kind of communion with nature in that area. If you ever get to come to Tidewater, Virginia, you'll see that it's called Tidewater for a reason. It's a very feathery land. There are all these rivers and all these inlets and all these marshes. And it does, as she describes, kind of pulsates with the tides coming in and just the egrets and the life and the cicadas and the dragonflies. It is just kind of thrumming with natural light and life. And so all those things I spoke to me. And I'm so glad that she seemed poetic to you. So the other things that really I wanted her to be able to convey that I know well from that area, from growing up with, my father's family and knowing them and spending a lot of time down in that area, is that there is this deep affection, a multi-generational family attachment. Part of it's because it's a relatively rural world, back then for sure, not as much now, but definitely then. And the same was true of that kind of the seagoing mariner families, that live by farming and fishing. And I don't know, she just came to me in that really wondrous, pictorial, metaphorical kind of voice. It was a real delight just to kind of let her speak to me. And I don't always have that happen to me. I think she really came to me that way too, because this is a story about, it is a story about grief and the impact of that sudden loss, which requires, some reflection, and as well as, we should tell the listeners right now, there is a lot of action happening. There is a pig chase, there is exploding boats, there are, all sorts of things that go on, a lot of fast action plot points too. But her voice allowed me to have commentary and processing of everything she was trying to go through. And I told you earlier, and you tell me when to stop, but I had said I was writing this during the height of COVID. And it occurred to me that kind of sudden, unexpected, terrifying arrival of U-boats along our East Coast, for those who lived along the coast and worked the waters and would be on those boats potentially, or just simply walking along their wharfs, or on their farmland, like Louisa June's, it's up against the marshes, things drifting in from these explosions.
I felt like Louisa June was my friend almost when I was reading this, and I felt like I was going through the motions with her, and the grieving, and the happy points and the sad points, and the journey. And I felt like I was on that journey with her, because of the way it was written and how it was written. So I did want to share that with you. I just wanted to hug her.
Oh, good.
Her girl. Yeah.
Yeah, well, she's also, she has grown up in a family that reads a lot and talks and loves books and finds answers and beauty in books, as well as, the life around them. And she has this brother, Butler, who is the one who will be lost, who, as she says, when he remembers the poetry he wants to recite, that it's like watching a preacher man finding the spirit, getting ready to speak, right? So that, I'm so glad you enjoyed her voice, because it was a joy to just let her come out that way.
Yeah, I certainly did. So speaking of poets, you do make many literary references. You make references to Little Women. You make references to Yeats, to The Hobbit. Why these particular poets and books?
If you read others of my books, you will notice that I often reference literature or poems or musical pieces. I part of it is I like to share that with younger minds and maybe encourage them to read some of these, authors that I so love. I have to tell you that I have this amazing mentor. I don't know if you'll listen to this, but my romantic poetry's professor, the former provost of the university at Wake Forest University, has remained a good friend all these years. And he taught, Wordsworth and Blake, Yeats and Thomas. And I just really was so captivated by the romantics, many aspects of them, this deep love of nature, which you can probably tell is something that I grew up with and feel myself. My children would laugh and tell you, yes, she's always talking about birds and the toads in the yard and that kind of thing. I feel that great affinity and that great the joy of finding the sublime in nature, right? Which is all about what the romantic poets are about. And this professor, Dr. Wilson, Ed Wilson, so exuded all their philosophies, and especially his deep respect and admiration for the common man and the inherent nobility of the common man. And I hope that I reflect that in a lot of the writings I do. Yeats in particular had such an eye for the poetic within swans, or, other elements of nature. That I love kind of lacing that in, or with Little Women, or talking about Pride and Prejudice that Mama talks about being one of her favorite books, because it allows, and I tuck in as much as I can a little proto-feminist references through this book, right?
Absolutely do. It's wonderful.
Yeah. And it occurred to me, honestly, it's funny, this is one of those times where I did do a lot of research and I had it all at hand, but it synthesized itself in many ways. I want to say on its own, because it's not magical like that, but these things did kind of collide and then knit themselves together for me while I was writing, including these different bits and pieces of literature. And I was trying to remember for you why I named her Louisa June, except it allowed me to kind of, it's a lot of different things that come into the fact that a lot of people that in my family, the older generations, they tended to have two names. They tended to use their middle name as well. And, it was just that kind of, it allows immediately for that slight kind of self-deprecating bit of humor that Louisa June, I hope, exudes, that she kind of goes, gosh darn it, if I just come earlier in May, I could have been Louisa May, and then I would have been a direct reference to Alcott and perhaps Smarter kind of thing. So I don't know. I feel like, I think I will make another bow to Wake Forest and the great good fortune I had in my professors there. I had a really wonderful liberal arts education, which, you purposefully learn many different things. You do learn about music, you do learn about philosophy, you do learn about history, so that you have kind of more of a full-bodied experience of life. And when you can reference other things, you can make your points richer and deeper and wider and broader when you can, throw in a little bit of poetry to illustrate what you're also describing yourself. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Who's your favorite? Do you have a favorite poet, author?
Well,
Right.
a poet I really love right now and read her frequently, Mary Oliver, who is in many ways an offshoot of Romantics in terms of her absolute delight and love of nature and tiny little aspects of nature. I certainly love, I do love Yeats. How can you not love an author who talks about the Buccaneers of Buzz kind of thing? Oh, no, that's oh my gosh, that's Emily Dickinson. Be loud glade, as he describes. So Emily Dickinson is a big favorite of mine too, actually, again, because of her being able to get past the, large constraints within her life. To make large statements about tiny things, to see the beauty and the majesty within little things,
Yes. Yeah. Oh, beautiful. Back to the book.
Yes.
One,
Oh, the place.
one lesson I did get from reading this book, Louisa June and the Nazis and the Waves, is that there is beauty and strength in sadness and despite of sadness. And I'm just wondering, is that something you purposely wanted to get across to readers?
Very much so. As I was saying before, I was working on Louisa June during the absolute worst of COVID, when we had right at the beginning, when there's just so many horrific deaths so fast, and we were just kind of trying to grapple with this unforeseen deadly menace. I could not have foreseen the awful statistic that we have right now, which is, according to NIH, there are more than 200,000 American children under the age of 18 who have lost a primary caregiver to COVID, either a parent or a grandparent, whoever was their immediate, they lived with and took care of them, 200,000 children. So I wanted to provide them a story. I've learned as a historical fiction writer that sometimes taking harder issues and giving a little bit of distance, not putting it in present day, it takes kind of the heat of immediacy and a defensiveness out of readers, and they can suddenly see in thematical ways, oh, that's something that I have experienced or I know. I think I said before, this idea of this sudden danger coming up out of the waves, shooting, taking down a ship and then disappearing again, is not unlike the seeming capriciousness and stalking that COVID was doing at that time. And I wanted to give, I'm hoping that Louisa June strength and stubborn optimism about life, and having, that her journey will give young teens or tweens who maybe have had a loss of their own, a sense of reassurance and hope in the journey. I do think that we spend an awful lot of time trying to brush aside and not face up to sorrow. And I think that it's, as I actually, can I quote Cousin Belle here? She actually says to her, that my advice on sadness is to not ignore it, not dismiss it, stare sorrow straight in the face, recognize the pain for what it is. Then it will back down a tad and walk beside you, child. Maybe give you a little bit of a limp for a while or for forever, but it will not undo you or sneak up on you from behind in a surprise attack. Of course, doing that, facing sorrow head on and accepting its presence as an unwanted but tolerated companion, takes honesty, courage, and a bit of spit, which you have in spades. So I'm hoping that her example will just help, some of the readers get through that. There's also an undercurrent of depression within the story with her mother, who has the melancholy, as she describes. I know you really like that opening part. I have to say that just came to me. I just wrote that down. And I don't often say this, but my own mother had pervasive depression when I was growing up during the 60s, when we didn't have the kinds of treatments and, treatments and medicine that we have today, or an understanding really of it. So I, like Louisa June, grew up watchful, always kind of assessing my mother's mood to know how to act, how I might help. I too filled my, I'm reading from something here just to keep me on track. I too filled my mind's pockets with little amusing stories and something's nice, as Louisa June does, to help cheer her mother up, right? And it probably helped me grow up to be attentive reporter, and I hope a compassionate writer. And I think often, well, I know this actually from having looked at books and think about, one of the things I do as a journalist is try to fill a hole in coverage. I have that mindset still. There's a lot written for younger children about grief and processing grief and how to get through it and how to survive it. And then for older, YA to 20s, not a whole lot for this pocket of 10 through 14. So I was conscious about trying to do that as I was writing, and hoping that, I give them things to laugh about in some of the antics that Emmett comes up with, and, Cousin Belle with her troop of cats, but also talk honestly. And I hope with some poeticism about when we really love somebody, how we get through losing them.
It's beautiful. Very beautiful. I got that from the book, that it's okay to feel that way, not to avoid it, otherwise it will implode, but like the ocean, right? And the waves. And that really stayed with me. It was a very beautiful point, a very true point. So yeah, that did stay with me.
Thank you.
So my next question is, you have a lot of characters in this book, and they're all different, and they're great. They're silly, and some are serious and sad, and there's Louisa, who I love. How did you create them? Where did that come from? What is the process to create all these characters?
Oh, these are all such great questions, and hard question often.
Yeah. And how long, I guess, right? I guess that's part of it. How long did it take you to create these?
So this one came quickly to me. I do write pretty quickly. And again, it's because of having been a journalist for so long. I think being a journalist, for one thing, and when kids ask me about the best preparation for being a writer, I often say, write for your school newspaper all the time, get clips, interview people, follow them, learn to write on deadline, learn to write to space. It makes you much more disciplined, right? So the longest time that I take with all my books is with the research, because I have a really hard time stopping that. My editor is saying, yes, she does. Because I keep finding, oh, this is so interesting. Oh, this is so great. I have these file cabinets you can't see, but I just have these reams and reams of files and details and these anecdotes that are also amazing. But if you save string like a journalist, which is what I did about these U-boat attacks and these amazing mariners who stubbornly went back out to sea over and over again, even having ships blown out from underneath them, they're extraordinary people, right? You can save string and use it for the next book. So I already had all this kind of, information about those mariners and the attacks. And I hope we can come back to talking about the trail of crumbs that I followed creating the characters. But I think, again, having spent a lot of time as a journalist where I interviewed people and listened to them, you really learn that that dialogue is the quickest character reveal, right? So once I've kind of decided what characters I need to pepper in and where I need a foil and how big I'm going to make that family, right? I didn't mean to make the family that big, but I don't know, those brothers just kept talking to me. Or somebody like Cousin Belle, who has to be a mentor and a guide, just like in The Hobbit, right? She's one of those people who help guide and pull along our little Hobbit hero. Once I've decided of kind of this cast of characters, it becomes easier for me to delineate them by thinking about how they talk and what they would say. And once I kind of get their voice really drives a lot of what I do, especially for this novel, because I hope you, for instance, come to know Louisa June right away from those opening pages of her speaking so directly and honestly and heart achingly toward you. And yet also like, I'm going to fix this, even though I'm hurting, I'm going to fix this. I'm going to survive this. Somebody like Cousin Belle, she has a very specific voice, which helps make her the, singular kind of character she is. Now, for this particular book, because it is kind of close to home to me, both in topic and in the region, I know these people. I grew up with country philosophers. I had that great good luck of kind of straddling a weird fence of worlds here in Northern Virginia. Both, partly rural to city. Cousin Belle, and characters are always kind of an amalgamation of different bits and pieces of people and reading and research that you do. Cousin Belle, for instance, was very much modeled on this surrogate grandmother that I was incredibly lucky to have love me, who, here's how small town my world used to be. She and her maiden sister, the two of them never married. Her sister had been my grandfather's legal secretary while he was Commonwealth's attorney for a Virginia county. And so they just sort of became part of the family, which was the way of what had been small towns. It's not a small town anymore. But she was this bodacious, brilliant, strong-willed, one-time gorgeous woman who had become a lawyer back in the 1920s for the State Department. She was Yoda. And I had to be on my toes whenever, she loved us dearly, but she also very much wanted to, her opening line with me on any telephone call was, "What's up, darling?" And I better have an answer. I better tell her what I had read, what I was thinking, what I had seen, what I had done. She was just this incredible mind. And so Cousin Belle very much grew for me easily, for instance. With the, going back to the Menominee just really quickly in terms of like creating all the family members. And what was going to be the tragedy for that was I didn't design it out of the blue. I knew I wanted to write about these attacks. So there is any of you guys who are interested in this, there is a pretty esoteric website called uboats.net, which some librarians, thank you. Everybody say the huzzahs to librarians, because you guys are the keepers of truth and ideas and facts. So thank you. Librarians somewhere connected with the Maritime Museum in Tidewater, Virginia, has this website where they have taken every one of these attacks and listed where it happened, when it happened, what details they have of it. And then they somehow managed to get the list of the crew. And so it's there on the website, you have to keep clicking and digging and going. If they know what happened to that crew member, they'll say. So I was reading through, finding out, okay, what attack is going to be the linchpin plot point for me. And I tripped up on the Menominee, and it's an attack. It's a particularly heartbreaking, tragic, and vicious attack on a little tugboat, not a freighter, not a, everybody needs to read the book. I don't want to give the details, but as I was looking at it, that kind of stopped me, broke my heart a little bit. And then I started reading the list of the crew, and I kind of caught my breath, realizing there were two fathers and sons, last names, 45 years old, 22 kind of thing, clearly father and son. I dug a little bit more, kept following the links that they had on what they did have about these crew members, and saw that there was a 17-year-old boy on his first voyage, and that of the two fathers and sons, captain and a son, the cook and the son. One of the fathers, only 2 of the 18 crew members survived the Menominee attack. One was one of the fathers. And so, and both 22-year-olds and that 17-year-old were lost. It made me, as a mother, I was kind of overwhelmed with the thought of, oh my God, a 17-year-old child. Then I thought, oh my God, what if you were that parent and you survived, but your child didn't? And the story kind of came from there. The crisis, the challenges of parental grief and how another child deals with watching that, and the kinds of that terrible question of what if. I talk about that and describe it as like sea nettles, right? The first sting is that first question of, well, what if we hadn't done that? And I don't want to give away the plot point, but you'll know what I'm referencing. There's that one critical moment about a phone call.
Yes.
Yeah, we won't go further, but I'll just tell you that I fell upon that because, again, following the tracks, I found that there had been a lawsuit by the family members against the company that owned that tugboat because the flotation devices were faulty. They hadn't been updated. So also that check that sets her off, so that I found within those court records.
Oh, wow.
So it's a long kind of following of like, oh God, oh my God, I'm pulling this in. And then my imagination takes over, thinking about what kind of themes and what I will hope to be able to help my readers feel and potentially learn in a novel. So that's where Butler came from. That's a long answer to where Butler came from, but that idea of that beloved, poetic, incredibly gifted 17-year-old boy being lost and what that would do to his family came from that trail of going down those facts.
So how do you know when to stop with the research? It's all so fascinating.
It's really hard. I laugh because that's the hardest part for me. It's like, I don't know, I'm not a big chocolate eater, but if you're a big chocolate eater, it's like making yourself stop. The answer I would give in talking to students, for instance, and that does help me, is when I start coming across information that's repeating what I already know. So that then I know I've got the information. Now, as an old reporter, I want 2 corroborating sources at least. So once I've gotten the 2, if I found a third or a fourth, then I know it's okay. I don't need to research that anymore. I've got it. I know it. I've got the I've got the parameters and the spine of what I need to use. So that makes me stop. And also having to turn the book in makes me stop. And, again, too, I think having been a journalist for a long time, because sometimes I speak in schools a lot, and often kids will ask me, what do you do when you have writer's block? And I don't mean to be glib when I say this, but I will smile sweetly and then say, well, look, as a reporter and as somebody on staff in a magazine, if I didn't turn in my stories, I didn't get paid. So, if you have writer's block, you get up, you go get a drink of water, you walk around a little while, you splash some water on your face, and you come back and you sit down and you keep working.
In doing your research, do you feel like you were able to capture like some of these crew members' voices, or did you create all those voices from scratch? Or
no, Butler came from my thinking about, honestly thinking about Yeats and his voice kind of came to me. But with somebody like a Mr. Cooper, that wonderful older gentleman who is determined to get back on a ship with Daddy, to get back on the ship, that came from a wonderful set of articles, 3 of them, I think, that was written it was written by a woman too, and I'm forgetting what. It wasn't the Atlantic that it showed in, and I found it on JSTOR. There's another great, thank you, librarians. JSTOR.
You love JSTOR.
It's the best.
Yeah.
I found this article I couldn't find anywhere else, where a woman had actually, and God bless her, because that took some guts, walked into a bar in Brooklyn, as a matter of fact, where a lot of seamen went to. So she walks into a fairly masculine environment, right, and starts talking to these guys who were on these ships, and we're talking about. So, for instance, the brother who talks about Joe, who uses real 1940s lingo, talking about tin fish, calling Nazi submarines tin fishes, and the we better be careful of the swastika will be flying over the White House if we don't, I can't remember the exact language, but it's very rooted in that time. It came from quotes that I found from those articles that woman journalist wrote back in the 1940s, that really kind of, rough scrabble, again, pictorial. I mean, the colorful language. That if you can get these first, I always talk about primary documents. Again, thank you, librarians. Primary documents are the best because they give you the voice and the grit and the feelings and the poetry often of that time period, So there were certain characters that are minor ones in particular who are kind of iconic representatives of certain people, like the mariners. Or even hearing, for instance, the officer who comes after the event. Again, I don't want to give away where Louisa June gets hurt. Again, I was reading a newspaper accounts from that time, and the information about Katie did, the sister, and the thing about her going to dances for the USO, and the fact that they were keeping notes on the girls and how they behaved versus the guys.
Yeah.
What? So seeing that little detail, Katie kind of immediately came to me. Again, it's like I see a fact and it lets my imagination go, right? Somebody always asks how much is made up and how much is fact in historical fiction. Well, I would tell you that in good historical fiction, nothing's made up per se. You've read facts, you interpret the history, and then your imagination creates a persona that is plausible and tied to the facts of that time. So when I read that thing about, I thought about my own daughter and me, and how aggravated she would be, or I would have been, to learn that I had been, points have been put on me for whether I was behaving correctly with these, soldiers who might get a little, out of hand occasionally. The reaction of thinking like how my daughter would react to that is like Katie came to me pretty quickly, that she would, of course, not want to be going to these dances. That's nonsense. I want to become a Winnie welder and do something for real. I want to go put together Liberty boats. And I knew to do that too, because in reading about the Tidewater area, they were a massive war producing area, in terms of ammunition and ships and, parachutes and life preservers. The Tidewater, Virginia became quite a hub of our war effort in terms of producing things that we needed to fight. So does that answer the question?
It does, it absolutely does. It leads me to my next question, which is, all your characters are incredible and I love all of them, but do you have a favorite or maybe one that you enjoyed writing the most, one you relate to?
In Louisa June?
Yes.
Well, of course, Louisa June comes from my heart in many, many ways. Both in just how I must have had a lot of pent up desire to write semi-poetic prose because it just came out with her, which I'm really grateful for because her persona, her character needed that. So I kind of discovered a new gear for myself in writing her that I'd like to continue with. As writers, we always want to grow, with each thing that we write. So I do have an affinity for her, and having just grown up myself, having dealt with my mother dying when I was that age too, I just knew that there's not a whole lot out there for kids that age to read if they've experienced these things. So she's important to me in many ways, and I'm proud of her. In a way, I'm always engaged with all my characters, but there's something about her that was special. I had great fun, though, of course, writing Cousin Belle. I loved how outrageous in terms of her opinion she was and how fiercely protective she is of her, family. The fact that she would be driving around a souped up car and have marched herself off to be a gray lady in World War I and come back being followed by cats. I don't know. I just really loved all those different elements of her. And part of that too, I will tell you, my surrogate grandmother, Helene, her one kind of, I don't want to say soft spot, but her one, I shouldn't say one of her many endearing things is that she did love cats. And a special treat was that her one particular cat got a bowl of cream and 3 fresh shrimp every day. So I was very lucky to grow up knowing a lot of very full-bodied personalities who love to tell stories. You can probably tell.
So wonderful. It's great. My last question is, do you have any upcoming projects? Are you working on anything right now?
I do. I have, I actually just finished something that's not unlike, I forget, you and I are looking at one another. I forget that your listeners aren't looking at me. I just finished up a book that's called Bee and the New Deal Horse. So it is, again, set in Virginia, and it is about a young girl who, in the height of the Depression, is left at a horse farm, and the challenge is, can the horse farm survive, and can she find a place in this home with another older woman, who, Mrs. Scott, who is different from Cousin Belle, but a great deal more kind of austere. Can they help one another through this crisis? So that one will be out actually this time next year.
Wow.
And then I'm also working on one of my I'm a little not schizophrenic, but I'm happily diverse in my writing. I have not a series exactly, but I have a sequence of more political books. I wrote one on McCarthyism, which is called Suspect Red. I just had a book come out called Walls, which is about the Berlin Wall. And it going up in 1961 overnight, literally. And now I'm researching right now and beginning to write a book about the Watergate era. Those are very different, and they're for older readers, more, older YA to that new adult age, which I'm sorry that category doesn't exist as, as it did at one point. They've kind of given up on it, but it's such a great pocket to write for when you have these 20 somethings who are doing kind of phenomenal things within crisis inflections in our history. So anyway, so the Watergate book is kind of pulling more into that kind of, older to early 20s age group, I think. So there's a lot to talk about in Watergate. It's not just Watergate. The ERA was being done in at the same time as Watergate. And anyway, it's fascinating. Yeah.
One more thing. So at the end of Louisa June, you have all these, you have references in the author's note, and you include pictures and the background information. And I really like that you did that. And then you have a number from mental illness you include, which is just awesome, really.
Oh, good. Thank you.
And I just wanted to add that if you all want to know more about this, you have it right here in the book.
I do. Well, I always do that, especially since, I'm introducing younger readers or adults too. Adults can read my books too, to a lot of information. I want to give you more facts, than I could put into the narrative. So yes, it is the afterwards are their own special writing to make sure that I kind of give all that information and so that you guys can explore more about the characters, the real life characters and the real life events and what was going on during that time period. I also, at my website, if you all go, it's lmelliot.com. For each of my books, I don't think anybody else does this, but I started doing it, so I keep doing it. I felt the responsibility since I was writing for teenagers that if they want to learn more about the history, I'm going to give them the way to do that. So if you go to my website, you can learn a lot more about Winnie Welders or the, Merchant Marine or, what else is on that thing? And about coping with grief and suggested readings and music of the time and all that stuff. So
it's wonderful.
Oh, thank you. It's because I'm such an admirer of librarians. I want to provide some information. So
I don't have any more questions. Do you want to add anything else before we close the chapter?
No, I don't think so, except I really hope that people will find joy and see themselves and find inspiration about surviving tough times in Louisa June's story. And I'm so grateful for all the kind things that you have said about her. She is, I feel like she's a special character. So
she touched my heart. She definitely did. She is a beautiful character.
Thank you. I wish I could remember what it was that I lost my train of thought. It's never happened to me before.
I'm sorry.
No, that's me. I'm so sorry. I was obviously got on a tangent. That's the hard part, right, about writing is that there be really interesting tangents and then you go, where was I going? Anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you. So we are closing this chapter of Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library. Laura, I want to thank you for being on this podcast. If you all haven't done so already, please check out her book, Louisa June and the Nazis and the Waves. It's absolutely incredible and beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.